The morning of June 4, 1944. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, roughly 800 yards below the surface of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, a German submarine commander made a decision that would doom his boat and 58 men. Oberleutnant Sir C. Harold Langer ordered his crew to surface and abandon ship. U-505 rose through the dark water, her hull breached by depth charges, diesel engines still running, rudder jammed. The submarine began circling at 7 knots, a wounded animal drawing tighter and tighter spirals across the surface of the ocean. American sailors from the destroyer escort Pillsbury watched the German crew bail out through the conning tower, some still in their underwear, others clutching whatever they could grab before the boat sank. But U-505 did not sink. The scuttling charges the Germans had set failed to detonate properly. The valves they had opened were not enough. And within minutes, an 8-man American boarding party led by Lieutenant Albert David climbed through that same conning tower and found themselves inside an intact, operational German submarine, still running, still circling, abandoned but very much afloat. They found codebooks, Enigma machines, navigation charts, intelligence that would save thousands of Allied lives in the months before D-Day. And they found something else. Something the German crew had left behind in their rush to escape. Evidence of a fundamental miscalculation that had shaped the entire U-boat campaign. A miscalculation about American industrial capacity. About American shipbuilding. About the sheer material weight the United States could bring to bear once its economy shifted to total war. The German submariners of 1944 were drowning in a flood of American production they had been assured was impossible. This is the story of how Germany's naval intelligence catastrophically underestimated the United States Navy. It is the story of planners who calculated tonnage with Prussian precision, but failed to account for American shipyards that could launch a Liberty ship in less than 5 days. It is the story of U-boat commanders who watched their wolf packs shattered not by superior tactics or better technology, but by simple overwhelming numbers. Escort carriers that appeared faster than intelligence said they could be built. Destroyer escorts that multiplied like cells under a microscope. Merchant ships that replaced losses at 3 times the rate German analysts had predicted. And it is the story of the moment when Germany's most successful naval officers looked at the evidence accumulating around them, the wreckage of their strategic assumptions floating in the North Atlantic, and understood that they had been fighting a war they could not win. Not because they lacked courage. Not because their submarines were inadequate. But because they had fundamentally misjudged the industrial capacity of the nation they were fighting. The problem began in the late 1930s when German naval planners tried to estimate how many ships the United States could produce if it entered a European war. Their calculations were methodical. They studied American shipyard capacity. They analyzed steel production. They examined labor availability. They looked at the Depression-era merchant marine, which had averaged construction of fewer than 12,000 tons of shipping per month through the 1930s. They examined British intelligence estimates. They consulted with officers who had served as naval attachés in Washington. And they arrived at a figure that seemed reasonable, even generous. In 1942 and 1943 combined, German naval intelligence concluded the Americans could produce approximately 15,300,000 tons of merchant shipping. It was a careful estimate, a professional estimate, an estimate that accounted for American industrial potential while recognizing the limitations of shipyard infrastructure, the time required to train workers, the competing demands of aircraft production and tank production and all the other material requirements of modern war. It was an estimate that incorporated every known variable, every measurable factor, every piece of intelligence the German naval staff could gather. It was an estimate that would prove to be catastrophically, world historically wrong. The actual production figure for those 2 years would be 17 million tons. 2 million tons more than the highest German projection. But that number, stark as it is, does not capture the full scope of the miscalculation. Because German planners had not merely underestimated American production. They had failed to understand that American shipbuilding would undergo a revolution that made Depression-era construction methods irrelevant as reference points. They had not anticipated that a construction magnate named Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life before 1941, would apply assembly line techniques to shipbuilding and transform the industry overnight. They had not predicted that American shipyards would perfect prefabrication methods that reduced construction time from 8 months to 42 days on average, with individual vessels completed in less than a week. They had not foreseen that the United States would build 18 entirely new shipyards specifically for Liberty ship construction, employing 650,000 workers, many of them women, many of them pulled from industries that had nothing to do with shipbuilding. The Germans knew the Americans were capable of mass production. They had seen Ford's automobile plants. They understood industrial efficiency, but they had calculated based on traditional shipbuilding methods, where vessels were constructed piece by piece on a single berth over months of careful work. What they encountered instead was something fundamentally different. A system where complete deckhouses were fabricated off-site, where double-bottom sections and stern frame assemblies arrived at the shipyard already complete, where bow units were lowered into place by crane, where sections were welded together rather than riveted, saving both time and steel, where the same ship design was repeated 2,710 times, allowing workers to become specialists at individual tasks rather than generalists who needed to understand entire vessels. At the peak of production in 1943, American shipyards were delivering 3 Liberty ships per day. 3 ships. Every single day. Each one capable of carrying 10,800 deadweight tons of cargo. Each one a replacement for vessels the U-boats were sinking. Each one a margin of safety in the tonnage war. The numbers were staggering. By the war's end, the United States would produce 5,500 vessels of all types. Among them, 2,710 Liberty ships alone. Ships built so fast that Admiral Karl Donit's strategic calculations, which required sinking 700,000 tons per month to win the tonnage war, became mathematically impossible to achieve even as his U-boat fleet expanded. Consider the arithmetic. In June 1942, at the peak of what U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time, when German submarines were ravaging poorly defended shipping along the American East Coast, the U-boats sank 325,000 tons. It was their highest monthly total since March of that year. It was a devastating blow to Allied logistics. It was also insufficient. Because even at that moment, even in their moment of greatest tactical success, the U-boats were not sinking ships faster than American yards could replace them. The production gap was closing. The flood was beginning. And German naval intelligence did not see it coming because they could not conceive of the scale of what American industry was about to become. The men who planned Germany's submarine campaign were not fools. They were professionals. Kriegsmarine officers with years of experience, some dating back to the First World War. They understood naval logistics. They understood industrial production. They had fought in the previous war's submarine campaign and knew what it took to strangle an island nation dependent on imports. When Admiral Donitz calculated that 300 U-boats operating in wolf packs could sink enough tonnage to force Britain out of the war, he was working from sound strategic principles. The math was brutal but simple. Britain imported 17.5 million tons of goods annually in the late 1930s. If U-boats could sink 1 million tons per month, they could reduce British imports by more than half within a year. Starvation would follow. Industrial collapse. Political pressure to negotiate. The strategy had nearly worked in 1917 before the convoy system defeated it. But Donitz's calculations in 1939 assumed Germany would have time to build that 300-boat fleet before war began. He requested it. He explained why it was necessary. And he was denied. When war came in September 1939, the U-boat fleet numbered 57 boats total. Of those, only 22 were suitable for Atlantic operations. The rest were coastal boats, training vessels, boats undergoing maintenance. Donitz later wrote that seldom has any branch of the armed forces of a country gone to war so poorly equipped. It could, in fact, do no more than subject the enemy to a few odd pinpricks. Hitler approved a crash construction program. Build 400 U-boats as quickly as possible. Expand the fleet. Give Donitz the tools he needed. But construction took time. Training crews took time. Working up new boats took time. It was not until 1943, 4 years into the war, that the U-boat fleet reached the numbers Donitz had said were necessary. For years during which the strategic situation had changed completely. For years during which the Allies had developed convoy tactics, trained escorts, built the infrastructure to fight back. For years during which American industry had begun its transformation. The first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, was launched in Baltimore on December 30, 1941. 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. She took 244 days to build using conventional methods. But the Maritime Commission and the shipbuilders were learning. They were experimenting. They were applying the lessons of mass production to a craft-based industry. By 1943, median construction time had dropped to 39 days. 39 days from laying the keel to launching the completed vessel. And even that figure understates the revolution. Because some ships were built faster. The SS Robert E. Peary holds the record. 4 days, 15 hours, 30 minutes from keel to launch. Less than a week. A complete ocean-going cargo ship in less than a week. German intelligence officers studying American production capacity in 1941 could not have predicted this. The data did not exist to predict it. Traditional shipbuilding methods provided no basis for extrapolation. When they calculated American potential, they were calculating based on a world that was already disappearing. A world where ships were built the way ships had always been built. Slowly, carefully, one at a time. The world that emerged instead was one where assembly lines applied to shipbuilding-produced vessels faster than submarines could sink them. And Liberty ships were only part of the equation. The United States was also building destroyer escorts specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. Smaller than fleet destroyers. Cheaper to build. Optimized for convoy protection rather than fleet action. The British called them frigates. The Americans called them destroyer escorts. Both nations built hundreds of them. In 1943 alone, the United States commissioned 233 destroyer escorts. In addition to those, American yards built 66 destroyer escorts for the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease. And 26 escort carriers. Small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls. Jeep carriers. Baby flat tops. Half the length of fleet carriers, a third of the displacement, slower, carrying fewer planes. But cheap enough to build in quantity. Fast enough to deploy within months rather than years. These were the vessels German intelligence had not anticipated. The material weight of American production applied to naval construction with the same ruthless efficiency Ford had applied to automobiles. 11 escort carriers entered service in 1942. 24 more in 1943. Each one providing air cover for convoys. Each one enabling hunter-killer groups to pursue U-boats rather than simply defend merchant ships. Each one representing industrial capacity that German planners had not factored into their calculations. By May 1943, the convergence of all these factors would produce what German submariners called Black May. The month when the tide turned irrevocably. The month when 43 U-boats were destroyed. The month when Donitz withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic and admitted that the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. Not because German submariners lacked courage. They fought with desperate bravery, accepting an 85% casualty rate, the highest of any service in the war. Not because U-boat technology was inadequate. The Type 7 boat was an effective weapon, and newer designs promised even better performance. The battle was lost because mathematics defeated courage. Because industrial production overwhelmed tactical skill. Because Germany had entered a tonnage war against an opponent whose tonnage production they had catastrophically underestimated. The men inside those U-boats experienced the collapse of their strategic assumptions one convoy at a time. One depth charge pattern at a time. One aircraft attack at a time. They had been told that American production was limited. That the British merchant fleet was finite. That every ship sunk brought victory closer. If there's one thing you should take away from this story, it's how industrial miscalculation can doom even the bravest warriors to futility. And if you're finding value in these deep historical analyses, consider subscribing. It helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories. The statistical reality facing U-boat crews in early 1943 told a story their commanders did not want to acknowledge. In March of that year, U-boats sank 82 merchant ships in the Atlantic, totaling 476,000 tons. It was one of their best months of the war. The wolf pack tactics were working. Convoys were being mauled. Ships were going down faster than British shipyards could replace them. And yet the mathematics were already turning against them. Because while those 82 ships were sinking, American yards alone were launching more than that number in replacements. The gap between destruction and construction was closing. Then it reversed. April brought a shift. U-boat losses climbed to 15 boats. Their kills dropped to 39 ships of 235,000 tons. Still significant. Still painful for the Allies. But no longer enough. The escorts were getting better. The tactics were improving. And most critically, the mid-Atlantic air gap was shrinking as long-range patrol aircraft extended their coverage. B-24 Liberators modified for anti-submarine work could now reach areas that had been beyond air cover just months earlier. U-boats that had once been able to surface and recharge batteries in relative safety now found themselves under constant surveillance. Then came May. The month that would become known to German submariners as their Stalingrad. The month when the illusion of strategic viability shattered completely. The month opened with the battle for convoy ONS-5. 43 merchant ships escorted by 16 warships. A wolf pack of 30 U-boats assembled to attack it. On paper, the Germans had overwhelming force. 30 submarines against 16 escorts should have been a massacre. It was. But not the massacre German planners had anticipated. 13 merchant ships went down. But 6 U-boats were destroyed. 6. In a single convoy battle. The loss ratio had inverted. Escorts were killing U-boats faster than U-boats could sink merchants. 2 weeks later came convoy SC-130. At least 3 U-boats destroyed. At least 1 damaged. No merchant ships lost. 0. A wolf pack had assembled, attacked, and been driven off with total casualties for no gain whatsoever. Among the dead was Peter Donitz, the Admiral's 21-year-old son, killed when U-954 was sunk by 2 Royal Navy ships. The strategic calculus and personal tragedy converged in that moment. Donitz's own son had died in a battle that achieved nothing because the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire campaign were wrong. By May 24, 1943, Donitz had seen enough. He withdrew almost all U-boats from the North Atlantic. The order that went out to the fleet essentially admitted defeat. We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. It was not a tactical withdrawal to preserve forces for a renewed offensive. It was an acknowledgement that the campaign as conceived could not succeed. The numbers were brutal and undeniable. 43 U-boats lost in May, representing 25% of operational strength. 1,832 men dead. 183 survivors from boats that had been destroyed. This was unsustainable by any measure. Allied losses in the same period? 58 ships totaling 299,000 tons. Of those, only 34 ships totaling 134,000 tons were lost in the Atlantic. The exchange ratio had become catastrophic from the German perspective. More than 1 U-boat lost for every merchant ship sunk. And those merchant ships were being replaced faster than they could be destroyed. U-boats were not being replaced at all. German yards were producing 20 boats per month. But losses were now exceeding production. The fleet was shrinking even as it fought. The men who survived those convoy battles and returned to base brought stories that contradicted everything German intelligence had told them. Stories of escort carriers appearing in mid-ocean where no carriers should be. Stories of destroyer escorts that seemed to multiply with every convoy. Stories of aircraft everywhere, at all times, making it impossible to surface without being attacked. One U-boat commander described seeing a convoy protected by vessels his intelligence briefings had assured him did not exist. Small carriers launching aircraft from positions hundreds of miles from land. Fast escorts with sonar equipment that could track submarines with terrifying accuracy. Depth charges that exploded on contact rather than by depth-triggered fuses, making evasion far more difficult. These were the Casablanca-class escort carriers. Small, cheap, built on merchant ship hulls. Kaiser's yards would produce 50 of them before the war ended. Each one carrying between 24 and 28 aircraft. Each one providing air cover for convoys that had previously been defenseless in the mid-Atlantic gap. German intelligence had known the Americans were building escort carriers. What they had not grasped was the scale. 50 carriers of one class alone. Not fleet carriers requiring years to build. Escort carriers that took months. Some launched less than a year after their keels were laid. The destroyer escorts were even more numerous. The British called them frigates. The Americans called them destroyer escorts. Both navies built hundreds. These were not fleet destroyers. They were smaller, slower, cheaper. Optimized for one mission. Kill submarines. They carried sonar. Depth charge racks. Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars that could throw pattern of 24 contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking ship, allowing the escort to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack. Traditional depth charges had to be dropped behind and to the sides, disturbing the water and breaking sonar contact just when it was most needed. In 1943 alone, the United States commissioned 233 destroyer escorts for its own navy, plus 66 more for the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease, plus 26 escort carriers. All in 1 year. All while simultaneously producing Liberty ships at 3 per day. All while building fleet carriers and battleships and cruisers and fleet destroyers and landing craft and every other vessel type the war required. The scale was beyond anything German planners had thought possible. Consider the testimony of captured U-boat crews interrogated by Allied intelligence. Officers who had commanded boats in the Atlantic. Men who had seen the reality firsthand. They expressed disbelief at American production capacity. Some refused to believe the numbers they were shown. It must be propaganda, they insisted. No nation could build ships that fast. No economy could sustain that output. The statistics were impossible. Except they were not impossible. They were real. And they were drowning the U-boat fleet in a flood of steel. U-505 herself represented this dynamic. Oberleutnant Harold Langer had commanded her on her final patrol. He was an experienced officer. He had studied the intelligence briefings. He knew what threats to expect. When depth charges from USS Chatelaine breached his hull and jammed his rudder, when his boat began to circle on the surface unable to dive, he made the decision to scuttle and abandon ship. A reasonable decision under the circumstances. Save the crew. Deny the enemy an intact submarine. Standard procedure. What Langer could not have known was that he had encountered a hunter-killer group built around USS Guadalcanal. One of those escort carriers that should not have existed. Operating hundreds of miles from any land base with a task group of destroyer escorts whose sole purpose was hunting U-boats. Not defending a convoy. Hunting. Actively searching for submarines and destroying them. This was a level of anti-submarine capability German intelligence had said the Allies lacked the resources to deploy. Carriers were too valuable to risk in submarine hunting. Destroyers were needed for convoy escort. The Americans could not possibly spare the forces necessary for dedicated hunter-killer groups. Except they could. Because they had built so many ships that they had escorts to spare. So many carriers that they could risk one hunting submarines. So many destroyer escorts that convoy protection and offensive operations could be conducted simultaneously. The industrial abundance that German calculations had said was impossible had become operational reality. The boarding party from USS Pillsbury climbed into U-505's conning tower and found a functioning submarine. Codebooks. Enigma machines. Navigation charts. Intelligence that would prove invaluable. But they also found something more prosaic and more damning. Supply manifests. Fuel logs. Maintenance records. The routine paperwork of submarine operation. Documents that revealed how stretched the U-boat fleet had become. How long patrols had grown because there were not enough boats to maintain coverage. How maintenance had been deferred because boats could not be spared from operations. How crew quality had declined as experienced submariners died and were replaced by hastily trained recruits. The documents told a story of an organization under unsustainable strain. Fighting a war it could not win because the fundamental strategic assumptions were wrong. U-505's capture did not change the course of the war. By June 1944, when she was taken, the Battle of the Atlantic had already been decided. But her capture illustrated the gap between German expectations and Allied capabilities. She was supposed to be hunting merchant ships in an ocean where Allied escorts were stretched thin and air cover was intermittent. Instead, she encountered a dedicated anti-submarine task force operating with resources German planners had said did not exist. The truth was that by mid-1944, the Atlantic had become a shooting gallery for Allied anti-submarine forces. U-boats that ventured out faced odds that made survival unlikely. The casualty rate for U-boat crews over the course of the war would reach 7 to 9%. Nearly 4 out of every 5 men who served in U-boats died. The worst casualty rate of any branch of the German military. Worse than the infantry on the Eastern Front. Worse than bomber crews over Germany. Worse than anything except perhaps the final battles in Berlin. These men died bravely. They died following orders. They died doing their duty. But they died in service of a strategic miscalculation that doomed them from the start. The miscalculation was not tactical. German submarine tactics were sound. Wolf pack operations made sense. The Type 7 U-boat was an effective weapon. The men who crewed them were well-trained and motivated. The miscalculation was economic. It was industrial. It was the failure to understand that the United States could and would build merchant ships faster than submarines could sink them. That American shipyards would not merely replace losses but would increase production until losses became irrelevant. When German naval planners calculated that the United States might produce 15 million tons of shipping in 1942 and 1943, they were working from reasonable assumptions based on historical data. Depression-era American shipyards had produced an average of less than 12,000 tons per month. Even accounting for wartime expansion, even assuming American industry would ramp up production, 15 million tons over 2 years seemed like a generous estimate. It accounted for American industrial potential while recognizing realistic limitations. What those planners could not have predicted was that Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before 1941, would revolutionize the industry. That he would apply assembly line techniques to shipbuilding and transform it from a craft-based industry into mass production. That prefabrication methods would reduce construction time from 8 months to 42 days on average. That individual ships would be completed in less than a week when circumstances required it. The story of the SS Robert E. Peary captured this transformation perfectly. In November 1942, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard launched her 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after laying her keel. 4 days. From nothing to a complete ocean-going cargo ship in 4 days. It was a publicity stunt. Kaiser himself called it an incentive ship, meant to boost worker morale and demonstrate American capability. Normal construction at that yard took about 50 days, which was itself remarkable compared to the 244 days the first Liberty ship had required. But the Robert E. Peary proved what was possible when prefabrication and assembly line techniques were pushed to their limit. The ship was not built in 4 days in the traditional sense. Sections had been fabricated off-site weeks earlier. The yard had prepared everything in advance. When the keel was laid, workers were assembling pre-made components rather than building from raw materials. It was Ford's assembly line applied to shipbuilding. And it worked. The Robert E. Peary was launched, fitted out, loaded with 10,000 tons of cargo, and sent to war. She made multiple transatlantic crossings. She delivered cargo to Omaha Beach on D-Day under constant attack. She survived the war and was not scrapped until 1963. A ship built in 4 days lasted 21 years. German intelligence officers studying these numbers must have felt like they were reading fiction. 3 Liberty ships per day at peak production. 2,710 Liberty ships total by war's end. Each one capable of carrying 10,800 deadweight tons. Each one a margin of safety in the tonnage equation. Each one making Donitz calculations obsolete before the ink dried on the operational orders. At the start of the campaign, the U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons per month to win the tonnage war. This was achievable when British and American production was limited. Once American mass production came online, that target leapt to 1,300,000 tons per month. And that target was never achieved. Not in any month. Not even in March 1943 when U-boats had their best performance. We're now around the 20-minute mark, and this seems like a good moment to pause and reflect on just how catastrophic this miscalculation was, not just strategically, but for the thousands of young men who paid the price. If you've made it this far, You clearly appreciate thorough historical analysis, so please consider subscribing to support more content like this. The human cost of this miscalculation is difficult to comprehend. 30,000 German submariners died during the war. Roughly 41,000 served total. The casualty rate approached 7 to 9% when counting those killed, wounded, or captured. These were not untrained conscripts. U-boat crews were volunteers. They underwent extensive training. They were among the most skilled sailors in the Kriegsmarine. And they died in numbers that would have been unacceptable in any other branch of service. The men who served in the later years of the war, from mid-1943 onward, faced the worst odds. They were sent out knowing that their chances of returning were poor. They had seen empty bunks accumulate in their barracks. They had attended memorial services for crews that had simply disappeared. Radio contact lost. Position unknown. Presumed sunk. The fleet was dying. Everyone knew it. And yet they kept going to sea because orders were orders and duty was duty, and there was still a war to fight. A U-boat patrol in 1944 might last 2 months. 2 months submerged for most of each day, surfacing only briefly to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. 2 months breathing air that smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies and the chemical scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide. 2 months eating food that degraded steadily from fresh to canned to moldy. 2 months knowing that at any moment, depth charges could crack your hull and send you to the bottom with no possibility of rescue. 2 months watching the sonar pings grow louder as escorts triangulated your position. 2 months of this, and at the end, maybe you sank a ship or two if you were lucky. Maybe you encountered a convoy. Maybe you survived. The veterans who returned from early war patrols told stories that their younger crewmates struggled to believe. Stories of the happy times when U-boats roamed the American East Coast almost unopposed. When merchant ships sailed individually without escort. When a single submarine could sink a dozen ships in a patrol. When the odds favored the hunter. By 1944, those days seemed like myth. The ocean had become a hostile environment dominated by Allied forces that seemed omnipresent and overwhelming. Survivors described the sensation of being hunted constantly. Of never feeling safe even when running deep and silent. Of knowing that aircraft with radar could find you on the surface. That escorts with sonar could track you below. That there was nowhere to hide and no margin for error. One mistake, one mechanical failure, one unlucky detection, and you died. 7 to 9% of U-boat sailors died. That statistic represents 30,000 individual men. 30,000 submariner who left port and never returned. 30,000 families that received notifications. 30,000 casualties in a campaign that was doomed from the start by economic miscalculation. The strategic failure was not inevitable. If German planners had correctly assessed American industrial capacity, the entire submarine campaign might have been structured differently. If they had understood that the United States could produce ships faster than submarines could sink them, they might not have based their entire Atlantic strategy on tonnage warfare. Alternative approaches existed. Disrupting specific convoy routes. Targeting critical cargoes rather than total tonnage. Preserving the U-boat fleet as a strategic reserve rather than expending it in an unwinnable attrition campaign. But those alternatives required acknowledging that the original strategy was flawed. And that acknowledgement did not come until May 1943, when casualties forced Donit's hand. By then, 4 years into the war, the U-boat fleet had suffered losses that could not be replaced. The experienced commanders were dead. The veteran crews were gone. The men who understood submarine warfare through hard experience had been killed in numbers that left the fleet a shadow of its former capability. The replacements were brave and willing, but bravery cannot substitute for experience when you are being hunted by forces that outnumber you and have technological advantages you cannot counter. After May 1943, U-boats returned to the Atlantic in reduced numbers. They tried new tactics. They fought on the surface with enhanced anti-aircraft armament. They were equipped with snorkels that allowed them to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, reducing their exposure to aircraft. They received improved radar detectors. They got new weapons, new equipment, new orders. None of it mattered. The fundamental equation had not changed. Allied production still exceeded U-boat capability to sink ships. Allied anti-submarine forces still outnumbered available submarines. The tonnage war was lost and could not be recovered. Some U-boat commanders understood this before the official withdrawal. They could calculate the exchange ratios themselves. They could see that 3 merchant ships sunk at the cost of 1 U-boat was a losing proposition when the Allies could replace those 3 merchant ships in days, but Germany could not replace the submarine or its trained crew for months. They kept fighting because they were ordered to keep fighting. Because duty required it. Because there was no honorable alternative. But they understood that the war at sea was over. The capture of U-505 provided Allied intelligence with concrete evidence of German recognition of their situation. In documents recovered from the boat, in interrogations of the captured crew, in analysis of their equipment and operating procedures, a picture emerged of a force under extreme pressure. Boats staying at sea longer than was advisable because there were not enough submarines to maintain patrol schedules. Maintenance being deferred because boats could not be spared from operations. Crew training being abbreviated because replacement personnel were needed immediately. Quality declining across every metric as the fleet tried to sustain operations it no longer had the resources to conduct properly. The final year of the war saw U-boats relegated to marginal operations. They ventured into the Atlantic rarely and with little success. Most patrols resulted in the submarine being hunted and sunk before finding targets. The casualty rate climbed even higher. By 1945, a U-boat crew had perhaps a 1 in 10 chance of surviving a patrol. The mathematics of survival were brutal. And yet they kept going out because the alternative was surrender, and Germany was not ready to surrender. In the last months before Germany's collapse, U-boats continued dying in numbers that served no strategic purpose. In March, April, and May of 1945, 215 U-boats were scuttled by their own crews as the Reich disintegrated. Men who had survived patrols that killed 7–9% of their comrades destroyed their boats rather than let them fall into Allied hands. It was a final gesture of defiance in a campaign that had been doomed since May 1943. What might have happened if German intelligence had correctly assessed American production capacity in 1939 or 1940? If they had understood that the United States could build merchant ships faster than any submarine fleet could sink them? The entire course of the Battle of the Atlantic might have been different. Resources allocated to U-boat construction might have been directed elsewhere. Tactical emphasis might have shifted from tonnage warfare to disrupting specific critical shipments. The 30,000 men who died in submarines might have been deployed in roles where their skill and training could have been more effectively utilized. These are counterfactuals. History does not run experiments. We cannot know what alternative strategies might have achieved. What we know is that the strategy Germany adopted, based on the intelligence assessments they possessed, failed catastrophically. The failure was not immediately apparent. The early years of the war seemed to vindicate the submarine campaign. Tonnage climbed. British imports dropped. The strategic concept appeared sound. But the underlying assumptions were wrong, and when American production came fully online, those wrong assumptions destroyed any possibility of success. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies in May 1943. Military historians generally agree on this point. U-boat losses in that month exceeded any level the Kriegsmarine could sustain. Donit's withdrawal was an admission that the campaign as originally conceived had failed. Submarines continued operating in the Atlantic for the remainder of the war, but they never regained the initiative. They became a defensive force, reacting to Allied operations rather than shaping the maritime campaign. And the reason for this defeat was fundamentally economic. Not tactical. Not technological. Economic. Germany had entered a tonnage war against an opponent whose tonnage production they had underestimated by a factor that made victory impossible. The submariners who fought and died in that campaign were casualties of a strategic miscalculation made years before the first torpedo was fired. They were brave. They were skilled. They were committed. And they were doomed from the moment American shipyards began applying mass production techniques to vessel construction. The legacy of this miscalculation extends beyond World War II. It stands as a lesson in the importance of accurate intelligence and realistic strategic assessment. Military planning requires understanding not just your own capabilities but those of your opponent. And understanding your opponent requires going beyond what you expect them to do and considering what they might be capable of doing if they fully mobilize their resources. German planners looked at Depression-era American shipyards and extrapolated forward based on traditional construction methods. They failed to anticipate that American industry would reinvent shipbuilding. That failure cost 30,000 lives and lost a campaign that was strategically critical to Germany's war effort. Today, the few surviving U-boats rest in museums. U-505 sits in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, the only German submarine in the United States. Visitors can tour her cramped interior, see the narrow bunks where men slept in shifts, examine the control room where commanders made life-and-death decisions, stand in the torpedo room where weapons were loaded for attacks that grew increasingly rare as the war progressed. The boat is a memorial to the men who served in her and in boats like her. Men who fought in a war at sea that was lost not through any failure of courage but through economic miscalculation at the highest levels of strategic planning. The lesson is clear. Industrial capacity matters. Production matters. In modern warfare, the ability to replace losses and sustain operations depends on economic foundation as much as tactical skill. Germany's submariners were among the finest sailors in the world. They faced the highest casualty rate of any military branch in the war. And they lost because they were fighting a tonnage war against an opponent who could produce tonnage faster than they could sink it. That is the essential truth of the Battle of the Atlantic. Everything else is detail. The 43 U-boats lost in May 1943 represented not just machines but crews. Approximately 2,000 men died that month in submarines. 2,000 men whose families received notification that their son, husband, father would not be coming home. 2,000 casualties in a single month in a campaign that was already lost. The mathematics were undeniable by that point. Allied ship production exceeded U-boat capability. The gap was widening, not closing. Every month, more escorts entered service. More aircraft deployed to patrol routes. More hunter-killer groups formed to seek out submarines. The trend lines all pointed the same direction, toward German defeat. And in the dockyards of Britain and America, the production continued. Liberty ships slid down the ways 3 per day. Destroyer escorts commissioned by the dozen. Escort carriers joined the fleet in numbers that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The flood of production that German planners had said could not happen was happening. And it was drowning the U-boat fleet in steel and fire and depth charges and sonar and radar and everything else that modern industrial warfare could bring to bear against submarines that had nowhere to hide and no way to win. This is the story that U-505 tells. Not primarily the story of her capture, though that was remarkable, but the story of what she represented. A weapon system deployed in service of a strategy based on flawed intelligence. A crew sent to sea with inadequate support because the resources to support them properly did not exist. A campaign that continued long after it had been lost because admitting defeat was intolerable. And 30,000 men who died because their leaders had miscalculated the industrial capacity of the enemy they were fighting. The Battle of the Atlantic was not decided by any single engagement. There was no midway moment, no Stalingrad for the submarine fleet. The decision came through accumulation. Through the steady mathematics of exchange ratios turning against the U-boats. Through Allied production exceeding German sinking capacity. Through the slow, grinding attrition of a force that could not sustain its casualties while its opponent grew stronger with each passing month. May 1943 was when the trend became undeniable. But the trend had been building since American shipyards began mass-producing Liberty ships in early 1942. The men who planned Germany's submarine campaign were professionals. They made reasonable assumptions based on available intelligence. They structured a strategy that should have worked given what they believed about Allied capabilities. Their mistake was not stupidity or negligence. Their mistake was failing to anticipate that American industry would undergo a revolution in shipbuilding techniques. That the United States would build 18 entirely new shipyards employing 650,000 workers, many pulled from industries that had nothing to do with shipbuilding. That Henry Kaiser would apply Ford's assembly line to ship construction and make it work. These were developments that seemed unlikely based on historical precedent. But they happened. And they destroyed the strategic foundation of the U-boat campaign. In the end, Germany's naval intelligence misjudged the American Navy not because they were incompetent but because they were reasoning from incomplete understanding of American industrial potential. They saw the Depression-era shipyards and assumed those represented an upper bound on capacity. They calculated production based on traditional methods and assumed those methods would continue. They underestimated American willingness to innovate, to experiment, to throw out every assumption about how ships had always been built and start fresh with new techniques. That underestimation cost them the Battle of the Atlantic and with it any hope of strangling Britain's supply lines. The memorial to those 30,000 submariners is not primarily in statues or monuments. It is in the recognition that they fought bravely in a losing cause. That they did their duty under impossible circumstances. That they died not through any failure of their own but through strategic decisions made years before they ever set foot on a submarine. Understanding their sacrifice requires understanding the economic miscalculation that made their sacrifice inevitable. The planners who underestimated American shipbuilding capacity condemned those men to death before the first U-boat sailed on patrol. That is the harsh truth of the Battle of the Atlantic. Industrial production defeated tactical excellence. Economic capacity overwhelmed military skill. And 30,000 German submariners paid the price for their leadership's failure to accurately assess the capabilities of the opponent they were fighting. The last word belongs to the numbers. 15,300,000 tons. That was the German estimate for American merchant ship production in 1942 and 43 combined. The actual figure was 17 million tons. But that gap of less than 2 million tons does not capture the full scope of the miscalculation. Because German planners had not merely underestimated production. They had failed to understand that production would accelerate. That techniques would improve. That by 1943, American yards would be launching 3 Liberty ships per day on average. 2,710 Liberty ships total by war's end. Plus Victory ships. Plus escort carriers. Plus destroyer escorts. Plus everything else the war required. The mathematical impossibility of winning a tonnage war against that level of production was evident to anyone who studied the figures honestly. Donitz reached that conclusion in May 1943 and withdrew his wolf packs. The campaign continued for another 2 years, but it was a campaign without strategic purpose. A campaign that killed men and sank ships but could not affect the outcome because the economic foundation of victory no longer existed. If it ever had. The Battle of the Atlantic stands as history's clearest example of how industrial miscalculation can doom a military campaign before the first shot is fired. The bravery of individual warriors cannot overcome structural economic disadvantage. Tactical skill cannot compensate for being outnumbered and outproduced. And strategic vision fails when based on intelligence that fundamentally misunderstands the opponent's capabilities. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most consequential miscalculations compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. These forgotten stories of strategic failure and human cost deserve to be remembered and understood, not just as history but as lessons that remain relevant today.